Good afternoon, and first, of course, I want to express our solidarity with the United States after the horrible attack in Orlando, and to present our condolences to our American friends, and especially to the LGBT community, because these guys were killed because they were gays. Unfortunately, France has suffered several attacks in 2015, and so we do know what means this horror for the families, for the friends of the victims, and also for the national community. But I really do trust the Americans to face this scourge while keeping their values and their trust in their democratic institutions. We are on your side. So I've spent 5 years in New York as permanent representative to the UN, so you can guess that I have a personal commitment to this organization. As you know, I'm going to speak about climate change, but the UN is an organization which has a role to play well beyond climate change in a lot of fields, from humanitarian action to peacekeeping to global development, to gender equality and so on. I will add a specific item, for the Americans, because they are not very keen on this one, and we would want them to support us, which is the reform of the Security Council. It's something that the French are a bit trying to spread the gospel, but in the desert. But if you want to have a UN which is relevant, you need to have relevant institutions. The Security Council today is the reflection of 1945. It doesn't make any sense to have a Security Council where you don't have countries like, as permanent members, countries like India, like Japan, you don't have or Brazil or Germany, and you don't have a representative of Africa as permanent member. I think the reform of the Security Council is an element totally critical, and we would really appreciate if the American administration would support us in our endeavor. Thank you. As for the climate change, after the success of the Paris Agreement, and I insist that this success is partly due or largely due to the support of the Obama administration. I think the way this administration has supported us to get a success in Paris has been totally critical, and especially the way President Obama has succeeded to bring the Chinese on board. I think once we had the Chinese on board, really, in a sense, nobody could leave the ship, and that was certainly one of the basic elements of our success, and we are very grateful to the president and to his administration for that. So now, 2016 is the year that must keep the Paris spirit alive. That means, in practice, that we need to speed up the concretization of the Paris Agreement, and there are three main issues. The agreement's ratification process. The second one will be the implementation issues, and finally, what must be done right now before 2020 and the entry into force of the agreement. So first, the ratification process. After the great signing ceremony in New York on April the 22nd, in which 175 countries participated, which is really a major, it's time for ratification. 17 countries have already ratified the agreement. We need to reach 55 countries accounting for 55% of the emissions, to have the agreements, really entering into force. The United States and China, which together represents 38% of the total emissions, have pledged to ratify the Paris Agreement before the end of the year. Ratifications by European countries will be critical as well. France is taking the lead to expedite the process while ensuring that it's viable. The French Parliament has just cleared the way for France's ratification of the agreement 2 weeks after Hungary. that will hopefully create traction for the rest of the EU member states. Second point, the implementation issues. Even before the agreement is ready to come into force, the nations of the world are working on its implementation. It was the main purpose of the recent meeting that took place in Bonn, Germany, from May 16th through May 26th. The 196 parties to the COP got together for the first time since December 2015. These meetings were very successful in demonstrating the strength of the commitment to the Paris Agreement. Nobody tried to challenge it or to reinterpret certain parts. And it was a real danger, because when you were in Paris, when there was this pressure for accepting the agreement, you could think that, well, later on, some countries will try, in a sense, to reinterpret the treaty or to say, well, we didn't accept everything, we have to look at it. Actually, it was not the case. Developing countries, in particular, have emphasized the adaptation issue, which is in the wording of the climate change is how to cope with the consequences of climate change. It's of course a good question to address because it's critical to the success of the Paris Agreement. An OECD study carried out in 2015 shows that only 15% of international climate funding relates to adaptation. So there is no question that much remains to be done on that front. The Green Climate Fund is a good mechanism for progress. The collective goal is to reach a funding capacity of $100 billion per year by 2020. Developed countries have a special responsibility in that regard. And I think I want to insist on that. In a sense, the developing countries are telling us, okay, what you are asking us is not to do what you have done in the last 50 years, which is true. We, the developed countries, we have polluted a lot, we have emitted a lot of gas, and suddenly we said to the developing countries, don't do the way that we have done. So in a sense, they tell us, you need to help us, and I think it's a legitimate question. So the developed countries are ramping up their contributions in order to live up to this legitimate expectation. France, for instance, will raise its contribution from $3 to $5 billion each year. Other critical issues, especially the reporting methodology and the 5-year review mechanism, are also being discussed. And they are very, it may sound bureaucratic and not that sexy, but it's very important that all the countries are going to report to their peers what they have done in a way of implementing their commitments. Of course, we are not going to send the army to oblige a country to implement its commitments, but it will be a real peer pressure if what they are doing is made public, and that everybody, and especially the public opinion, especially the NGOs, will be able to say, really, okay, bravo, or actually, you should do better. And of course, some countries are trying to make the reporting system or the review mechanism, really as weak as it may be. So it's very important that after having the principle of this reporting and review mechanism accepted, which was quite difficult, we have to concretize it in an open, transparent, and constructive manner. So all the countries which have signed the agreement are making the preparations required to implement their nationally determined contribution, the NDC, that they announced starting in 2020. Everybody so far is doing its own work, whether it relates to budgetary measures, legal frameworks, or public policies and strategy. Very often, before the Paris Agreement, I was asked, what will be the success of Paris Agreement? And my answer was, it should be the moment when everybody, the states and the other stakeholders will say, we are serious about a low carbon economy. And I have really the impression that we reach this point. And I think the evidence of it is that today, nobody, as I have said, is really, in a sense, contesting what has been decided in Paris. Third element is acting now and on to the 2020. We have to continue to make progress on the Paris Agreement's implementation roadmap. We also need to demonstrate that we are moving forward every day and across the board to combat climate change. COP22, which will be in Marrakesh, in November, will be about combating climate change on a daily basis. It will be dealt on the basis of what we call the Action Agenda. It is a platform that gathers together all the climate initiatives, public and private, global and local, official and non-official. And this alliance was actually a key to the success of Paris, and it will be equally instrumental for the success of Marrakesh. The problem of fighting climate change is that it won't be decided by the governments alone. It's not a top-down approach. It's not tomorrow the government of the United States saying, okay, we have to do that. It's good, but it's not enough. We need the mobilization first of the territories. What the cities are doing, it's extremely important. And actually there was a summit of the cities in Paris, organized by the mayor of Paris and by Michael Bloomberg, who was the special representative of the UN Secretary General. And the cities, tomorrow the cities are really responsible of 70% of the world emissions. We need also to have the mobilization of the scientists, because we need the technology. And actually the technology is much closer to be here than people generally believe. It's incredible. I've spent months to visit laboratories, to visit also to meet the CEOs of the American corporations. And also we need business on our side. And contrary to what you may hear on the Hill, actually the business community is really behind the idea of fighting the climate change. And so we have to ensure that the key role played by the non-governmental actors and the private sector, really could be brought into our endeavor. Businesses and investors are the ones who make the energy transition happen. No fewer than 70 initiatives, private, public, and mixed, were launched during the COP21 and have already entered the implementation phase. I will give you very quickly 2 or 3 examples. When an ambassador says very quickly, it means nothing. It means that usually it will be quite long. So really, the first example is the innovation mission, which is pushed forward by the US and France, and which aims to double public funding for research to accelerate global clean energy innovation. Because it's the key to making clean energy widely affordable. The first ministerial meeting, has taken place in San Francisco earlier this year. The European Union has joined the coalition. Collectively, the 21 partners represent well over 80% of global public investments in clean energy research and development. And they have taken the commitment to double this figure by 2021. My second example is the carbon pricing coalition, which is growing rapidly. Even the business community is telling us that they need carbon pricing. Why? Because carbon pricing will give them, the perspective they need to make their decisions of investment. So they will need a carbon pricing. And as you know, some states in the US are committed to carbon pricing. You have the state in the Northeast, 10 states, I think, on the Northeast. And on the West Coast, you have also the states of California, Oregon, and Washington, and working with some provinces in Canada. But also in China, actually, a lot of Chinese cities have decided to engage into carbon pricing. So France has just organized a high-level meeting on June the 10th to further work on this coalition. 40 countries and CEOs have joined the discussion. It's very encouraging. I think there is a process towards carbon pricing. And third, and that's for us, in a sense, it's the most important, the African Renewable Energy Initiative. And this initiative is aimed at achieving universal access to energy on the African continent. 10 gigawatts of new and additional renewable energy capacity is planned by 2020, with a potential of generating 300 gigawatts by 2030. It's a concrete response to the fact that 640 million people in Africa have no access to electricity. We need this initiative to succeed in order to counter the idea that it's necessary to choose between development and combating climate change. There are synergies, there are opportunities, and there is a huge potential in following the two tracks at the same time. In this regard, the Power Africa program, launched by President Obama and adopted by Congress earlier this year, is truly a milestone. So, ladies and gentlemen, your country has played and must continue to play an important role in many of these initiatives and in the climate change more broadly. Some people are saying, well, maybe it will depend on what happens on November the 8th. But actually, in a very surprising way, very surprising for a French to be optimistic these days, and maybe it's because I'm not in France right now, but I'm quite optimistic, because again, I have met mayors of cities, I've met CEOs of your major businesses, I have met scientists, governors, and everywhere in this country I've seen how much there is a mobilization of the Americans for combating the climate change. Your country is very creative, and its creativity right now is mobilized on this issue. So I am really quite at least optimistic, at least on your country. The United Nations, for its part, the United Nations has the power to galvanize and to mobilize efforts possessed by no other organization. And that's precisely why your work here in the US is so essential. There are no small actions when we talk about fighting climate change. So I really want to thank you for everything you are doing. When a city, a business, a university makes the commitment to reduce its carbon footprint, it brings us one step closer to the goal that we all share. Before I conclude, I want to take this opportunity to commend our Moroccan friends for the effort they are making to ensure a successful COP22 presidency. I wish the best to the next UNFCCC Executive Secretary, Patricia Espinosa, who will soon take over from a remarkable predecessor, Christiana Figueres. So thank you all very much. We need you, and we need the United Nations.